Coming up on Booked on Rock, it's the story of the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia, and the lasting influence of American counterculture with author Jim Newton.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Our guest is Jim Newton, who is the author of the new book, Here Beside the Rising Tide, Jerry Garcia, The Grateful Dead, and An American Awakening. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're recording on the last day of August, and Jerry Garcia was born August 1st, 1942, passed away August 9th, 1995. The book is an in-depth look at Jerry's life, the Grateful Dead, but also, as it says in the title, An American Awakening. It's an exploration of counterculture and its importance right up through to this day. So if you could talk about what inspired you to tell Jerry's story, but also with the 60s counterculture interwoven throughout.
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me. I get a couple ways to answer that question. The first one, I was a fan of the Dead growing up. I grew up in Palo Alto, went to high school in Palo Alto. They were sort of around me as long as I could remember. But back in the late 70s, early 80s, I think is when the culture around the Dead really made an impression on me. And I really felt like it was something to take note of, that it was something different about that music culture than any other bands or any other music that I had encountered, at least up to that point, and maybe ever. So that was kind of one thread of interest, was to make sense of that culture and to try to convey the power that it had on me and so many other people. At the same time, my sort of day job is writing about politics and government, and I've been doing that for the Los Angeles Times and Blueprint Magazine and a bunch of other places for many, many years. So I was interested separately in counterculture and in the ways that cultural figures move politics. Someone once wrote that no one did more to end the Vietnam War than Bob Dylan, which is an interesting statement if you think about it, since Bob Dylan really never even talked about the Vietnam War and certainly wasn't in a position to end it in the way that Richard Nixon was. And so that idea of the interplay of culture and politics has long interested me. And in fact, every other book that I've written is about politics and culture. The big difference this time is that the culture is kind of in the front of the story and the politics are more behind the story. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but I've been interested in counterculture and politics and in Garcia separately and relatedly for many years.
I always found it interesting because it depends on who's in the White House. It does affect the music that we hear.
Yeah, sometimes bad White Houses produce good music.
Right? The 60s. And
music is good when it's speaking out against or reacting in opposition to something, even if it's not directly addressing it. And that certainly describes the Grateful Dead well, I think.
There are a couple painful moments in Jerry's life early on that maybe casual fans listening may not know the specifics about. So just if you could talk about, one, the loss of his finger, and the other, the emotional loss with the sudden death of his father.
Two very traumatic episodes in back-to-back summers for very young Jerry Garcia. In the first, he was in the mountains in Santa Cruz at a cabin that his family often vacationed in, and he and his brother were playing around chopping wood, his older brother. And Jerry Garcia was putting up little pieces of kindling on a wooden sawhorse, and his brother was chopping them into smaller pieces. And they were playing around with it, and his brother accidentally chopped Jerry's finger off. His mother, who had been a nurse, tried to wrap it and rush him to a hospital, but they were a long way away, and he lost his finger. Of course, we all know him now as iconically missing that middle finger of one hand. Yeah, not a great start for a guitar player, obviously, but fortunately for him and for all the rest of us, it was not of his fretting hand. It was his right hand, not his left hand. And so he learned to play the guitar without the finger. He didn't ever have to adjust to not having a finger. But all of that, of course, is in the future. In the moment, he's a 4-year-old boy who's just had his finger chopped off. And so obviously a very rattling moment for him. And then the far more traumatic moment the following summer, he and his mother and father were up on a fishing trip in Northern California, and his father went out to fish, slipped on a rock, and drowned. A little bit of confusion of memory as to whether Jerry actually witnessed him drowning, but whether or not that's the case from that point forward, obviously he didn't have a father. His mother was overwhelmed by the challenge of trying to raise him and his brothers, so she turned the brothers over to their grandparents. So he was separated from both his mother and his father for a period. He developed asthma. It was a very difficult young life for Jerry.
His dad was just 45, totally unexpected. It wasn't like something that was coming. Yeah, that was traumatic. There's a connection here with Frankenstein. When I read the book, those two traumatic incidents kind of connect with this. He had a fascination with Frankenstein, and it just seems like once he watched that movie, it was like he was releasing all of that emotion in him that was left by those events.
Yeah, he saw the movie right about that time, and it really touched that core of loss and of reinvention and of magic. And to the very end of his life, regarded it as one of the most powerful movies he'd ever seen. So yeah, it made a real impression. And that is the same. It's a little bit after that period, but as he grows up on the peninsula in San Francisco, he discovers the arts and community, and I think he begins to find ways to patch that real hole in his heart. And I think it's no coincidence that the Grateful Dead family, as it's often referred to, had a kind of a familial structure. It felt like a community of artistic and like-minded folks. And so I think he very much, maybe subconsciously, but built a community around him that in some ways, I think, patched the hole in his heart left by those early days.
Yeah, it's amazing. Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein. That was the first one he
That's
saw.
the movie, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Dennis McNally was on here. He was the publicist for the Dead. He said towards the end of Jerry's life, he didn't want to do interviews. He was out of it at that point. And but the one time he did perk up, Dennis said, "There's a guy who wants to ask you about Frankenstein." I think it was for Turner Classics. Like, whoa! And he immediately woke up and he did the interview like that. He loved.
In fact, it's one of the last interviews of his life.
I can't imagine Jerry Garcia in the military, but he joined the Army in February of 1960 at the age of 17, and he was discharged. And then on December 12th, 1960, he packs his things, leaves the Army. And you're right that he went to Palo Alto with a beat-up car, which died on his way there, but he soon settled in. Yet his life is without a real purpose or focus, and that's until February 20th, 1961. There's a moment in his early life that has a profound impact on him. Again, another moment that impacts him. He later said that this is where his life begins, and that was the slingshot. What happened?
He was in a car with some friends. They were living in and around Palo Alto at the time. They got in the car late one night, and as they were driving one friend home, were in a terrible car accident. The car flipped, overturned through that most of the occupants out of the car. One, Paul Spiegel, remained with the car and was killed. And it riveted young Garcia's attention. And it is, looking back on his life, he often pinpointed that as the moment where he realized that he had been aimless and it was time to focus and make something of his life. And obviously that lent itself to music and to what became a very compulsive need to practice and to learn and to get better. But up to that point, as you say, he'd really been sort of drifting. He really made his way to the Army just because he had really no place else to go. He was, unsurprisingly, a terrible soldier and didn't last long. So he'd been kind of knocking around from one thing to another. But he identified that car accident as a moment where things began to take shape for him.
Very anti-authoritarian. So yeah, again, just picturing him in the Army is just unbelievable. The formation of the Grateful Dead, you write, quote, "Their main singer didn't like to perform. Their bass player was still learning his instrument. Their leader hated to lead. They were the Warlocks, though not for long." How did the Warlocks, who eventually become Grateful Dead, come together?
Yeah, one of the many fun interviews I got to do for this book was with Huey Lewis, who grew up in the Bay Area music scene and knew the members of the Grateful Dead, and also his mom was connected to the Beatniks. Anyway, he has a lot of connections to this story, and he pointed out that something different about the way most musical, enterprises come together today, and even in those days, from the way the Dead did. So, if you're forming a rock and roll band or a country music band or whatever it is today, um, you would identify your musical needs. You identify the best banjo player you could find, or the best steel guitar player, or whatever, and you'd build it up that way as a musical enterprise. That's not the way the Grateful Dead came together. The way the Grateful Dead came together is a group of friends who enjoyed each other, who discovered acid together, and then learned to play together. Garcia identified Phil Lesh, as you note, as a possible bass player, although Phil Lesh did not play the bass when he identified him. So he liked him. He was intrigued by Phil was a classical composer, and was trained in classical music. Bob Weir had been in jug bands and was still a teenager at the time. And so they all and Bill Kreutzmann came to the band with a background in marching band music. So they all brought their own sensibilities, but they weren't picked because of their musical expertise. They were picked because they fit together and they enjoyed each other. And so the enterprise that developed, first the Warlocks and then later changed their name to the Grateful Dead, is really a friendship model that became a musical enterprise, not the other way around. And so, in that sense, I think it helped give an atmosphere to the band. It helped them, I think, identify with their audience. The early interplay with audiences was very much less structured than we would think of today. So it was the barrier between audience and musician was much more fluid. There is a casualness about their relationships, but a seriousness about the music that is, if not unique to the Grateful Dead, at least unusual to the Grateful Dead.
Weren't there differing accounts as far as when Jerry met Bob Weir?
There's a little confusion sometimes about it's New Year's Eve, but New Year's Eves are always hard to pinpoint because people always forget whether it's which year is going into which, right?
Yeah, and they may have had too many in them.
Well, and also that too, which is, by the way, a problem with interviews throughout much of this book.
Right,
pinning people's memories down has been a little tricky. But the fundamental story is everyone agrees on, right? Which is that Weir was wandering around one New Year's Eve, heard music playing, was drawn to it, ended up playing that evening with Garcia. And then they played in various musical configurations over the couple of years before they kind of gelled first into the Warlocks and then the Dead. But the basic story is sort of uncontested. It's just exactly placing it in time is sometimes a little tricky.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
We're going to take a break and be back.
One of the things I got out of this book that I didn't know about from Dead history is this Watts Towers in Los Angeles. This story about, this is in 1966, and how Jerry was impressed by the artistic expression by this one particular artist, but he imagined an alternate version for his own artistic expression, one that involved working with others rather than alone. And this I found fascinating. First, could you explain what the Watts Towers were, and then can you talk about how seeing the Watts Towers inspired Jerry?
Yeah, well, first, the Watts Towers are this very unusual, very cool, odd set of structures here in Los Angeles, where I'm joining you from. They are, it's ceramic and rebar, and they're tall and sort of ethereal and strange. They've weathered a lot of attempts to tear them down over the years. In more recent years, they've been protected, but early in their history, they were sort of built without any real permission. And so one night after the Watts acid test, Garcia, who'd been very high that night, he and other members of the Grateful Dead and Mountain Girl and a few others went out and saw the Watts Towers early that morning, the following morning. And he was struck, and anyone who sees them is struck by the sort of beauty, but also oddity of them. They're a very unusual set of structures. But I think what seems to have really made an impression with Garcia is the amount of effort that went into building this edifice all alone, and that's really not the model that he wanted for his artistic enterprise. Not to spend his whole life laboring on something that would be physical and iconic, but left behind. That instead he was really interested in an experiential model and something that the art would be the experience of creating the art. And that I think really is as well as anything can, that really describes the Grateful Dead project, right? It's not albums, it's not edifices of music, it's the experience of the music. And it goes a long way, I think, toward explaining why they were always so powerfully connected to audiences in live performance, and that they struggled, frankly, to capture that on vinyl or later tape or CD or whatever. But the point is, they were that the art really is in the relationship with the audience as the music is coming alive. And that's what Garcia comprehended probably for the first time that day, and really saw it in contrast to the Watts Towers.
Just read a great book on the Wall of Sound, which is
Yeah,
about
that's great.
the band creating something for the audience that everybody in the audience, no matter where they're sitting, they're going to get the best listening experience. And that built and built and built until 74, right?
Yeah, the Wall of Sound is a great book, by the way. I just read it myself. But yeah, the Wall of Sound actually has a fairly short life in the history of the Dead, just because it was also extremely cumbersome and really difficult to move from place to place. But to your point, exactly right. I think it's a manifestation of that commitment to providing audiences with as close as they could to perfect sound. I never had the opportunity to actually hear the Wall of Sound. I came to the Dead scene a couple of years after that, but it is legendary in Grateful Dead history.
Fantastic book. Brian Anderson, want to give due credit. The book is called Loud and Clear, Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound and the Quest for Audio Perfection.
Great title, too.
Yeah. How did LSD and Ken Kesey's acid test events in the mid-'60s in San Francisco have an effect on the Dead's approach to playing and creating music?
The acid tests are where the Dead takes shape, really. I think it is the formative moment for the Dead. Up to that point, they were playing, learning their instruments, playing a few small gigs. Magoo's Pizza in Menlo Park is a famous one, or set of them. But the acid tests are, well, first of all, what they are. This is in a period where LSD was popular and legal. LSD didn't become illegal in California until the end of 1966. So starting in 1965, Kesey, who had experimented with LSD and other drugs, and is, of course, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Sometimes a Great Notion, and several other books after that. Kesey was interested in LSD and in the opportunities that created, visionary opportunities it created. And so he created really what were parties initially, where the Dead performed, but that slightly misunderstands or miscomprehends, I think, what they were doing. They arrived and played their instruments, sometimes all evening, sometimes very briefly. But they weren't the main attraction. People didn't come to hear the Grateful Dead. They came to have this experience of LSD and lights and camaraderie and enjoying each other and music. And so the Dead would, like everyone else, throw a dollar into the hat and would participate in this event, in their case, by performing. But I think it's important both because it creates a model of spontaneity and improvisation that, of course, goes on to define the Grateful Dead as a musical project. But it also goes to this relationship that the Dead had with their audience, in that they're wandering up and off, on stage and off stage. There's not a barrier between them and others who are participating. That idea that the audience is fully participatory in the experience defined the Grateful Dead from that moment forward. I can remember in the 70s and 80s and 90s going to shows, and if they didn't perform well, feeling like I was partly responsible for that. There is this sense that the audience was in on it, right? That starts with the acid test. And so I think in many ways, that's the most important contribution that the acid test made to the Grateful Dead's history, is that they imbued the Dead with this sense of connection and energy exchange with the audience.
Our guest is Jim Newton. He's the author of the new book, Here Beside the Rising Tide, Jerry Garcia, The Grateful Dead, and An American Awakening. You have quotes from Jerry talking about freedom in the book. He said there is a lie about what freedom is. What was his understanding of freedom?
Yeah, I think he was trying to respond to the idea that freedom was just license, that it was just the just doing whatever you wanted whenever you wanted to do it. And some of his notions about freedom also grow up, I think, in opposition to this notion that music ought to be free. The Grateful Dead probably performed more free events than any band ever, really. They were constantly performing for free. But it was also important to Garcia that people recognize that he and his bandmates needed to make a living doing this, that it was a work for them, that he had worked his whole life to become good enough to perform for other people and for people to enjoy it. So music isn't free, really. Even if musicians sometimes make it available for free, there's a cost to it, and there is responsibility that goes with freedom too, however one defines it. So, what I like about his reading back through those interviews of that period is that it's a bit of a response to what I think other people thought that he thought about freedom. That people thought that people outside the hate and outside the sort of hippie scene in the 1960s thought that all that freedom meant to these young people was the opportunity to do drugs and sort of cut loose from society.
Free of
Garcia's
responsibility.
right, and free of any obligations. That's not what he meant by it. And you can hear him in those interviews working his way to a more thoughtful and comprehensive idea of freedom than just sort of dropping out.
Yeah, that's what with counterculture, the beliefs of counterculture started that way. And then as more people came from outside of San Francisco and moved into San Francisco, they clouded that whole belief up, and they were starting to believe like, hey, I can be free of responsibility, free of any, just have fun, do whatever I want. And with the Dead becoming bigger and bigger, they had to have a responsibility, and they had to make sure, and Jerry, I'm sure this was not something he enjoyed, but he had to understand this is now a business.
Yeah, Jerry Garcia's lifelong attempt to figure out what responsibility meant for him was a real struggle. I mean, in some ways, he was irresponsible. He was not an attentive father or husband. Of course, drugs eventually took a very serious toll on him. He really did not want to be regarded as the leader of the Grateful Dead, hated to make decisions for the band. And yet, every other member of the band looked to him as their central figure, if not exactly the leader. If you read the memoirs of the other members of the Dead, it's very telling. They all are about their own experience of the Dead and their relationship to Garcia, right? And so they at least implicitly acknowledge Garcia, and sometimes explicitly acknowledge Garcia as the central figure of their effort. And of course, the Grateful Dead ended as the Grateful Dead per se when Garcia died in '95. And so in all those ways, I think he spent a lifetime trying to avoid taking responsibility for at least for certain things, but being drawn back into it. It was especially by the '90s when the Dead was just this gigantic enterprise. It was very difficult to avoid any responsibility for the band or for its audience, and I think it wore him down. It was really difficult for him to do that. But he wanted to be an artist, and he was an extraordinary artist. He didn't want to be the leader of a California corporation or of a movement. But sometimes he had to be, and did it kind of kicking and screaming, but did when he had to.
Like the Frankenstein monster, it got out of control. Yeah, chapter 7 is titled Summer of Love. You explore the origins of counterculture. Where did it originate, and what is at the core of counterculture beliefs, which you've touched upon already a little bit? But
yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about counterculture, and it really doesn't have to be limited to the 1960s either. But there are several ways to, I think, attack that story. One is there is a kind of artistic progression, starting with Kerouac and Ginsberg, and even going back further to Whitman and others of artists who see themselves as outside mainstream culture. Sometimes we think of them as bohemians, artists not necessarily overtly political in their art, but committed to challenging conventional or dominant mainstream authority. I think the Dead and Garcia fit very neatly into that history of bohemian artists. Again, not necessarily political in their rhetoric or or their confrontation with the mainstream authority, but offering an alternative to that that's appealing to people. To me, the Dead fit nicely into that history. But then there's also political history that comes to fruition or begins to come to the fore in the early 1960s. There's a major demonstration in San Francisco against the House Un-American Activities in 1960 or 61, I think it's 1960. By 1964, you have the free speech movement in Berkeley that is little incoherent at first, but begins to cohere around the idea that students are going to play an active role in fighting back against a administration and a government that they see as out of touch. That in turn, of course, is much amplified by the Vietnam War. So by the Summer of Love, by the Human Being, which is the January of the summer, or January of 1967, the Summer of Love is later that year. By the Human Being, you've got recognizable group parts of a counterculture. You have a sort of artistic counterculture, and then a more political counterculture. And in fact, the Human Being was billed as an opportunity for the tribes to gather, and in some ways that refers to the political tribe and the more artistic tribe. So all of that is swirling together in the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1960s, and by the mid 60s, of course, Ronald Reagan is elected governor. He becomes a real point of opposition for that gathering counterculture. And so by 1967, the major pieces are in place. You have the Berkeley radicals, you have the San Francisco hippies, you have the artistic and the political movements. You have Reagan as governor. It's then that you really start to feel this coalesce into something rather than a bunch of different pieces. It begins to feel like an actual movement, an actual counterculture.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
This is heavy. There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
I love the quote from Jerry when Warner Brothers releases the band's debut album in 1967, and Joe Smith, who signed the band to Warner Brothers, says at the record release party, and this is in the book, quote, "I want to say what an honor it is for Warner Brothers to be able to introduce the Grateful Dead and its music to the world." Jerry then says, "I want to say what an honor it is for the Grateful Dead to introduce Warner Brothers to the world."
Jerry's got a good sense of humor.
He really had a great sense of humor. And as you note, in their own way, each of them was right. Was it difficult in those early days for the band and Jerry to be working for a record label? Was it too corporate for them?
They struggled throughout, and they're not the only bands to struggle with a label, as you well know. But yes, they were committed to a kind of experimentalism that carried over into the studio. I mean, they racked up a lot of studio time playing with ideas. They got very much in debt to Warner Brothers.
Moxoa. The label's like, what am I doing with this?
And I mean, some of it is brilliant, but very laborious. They go over hours and hours and hours. And they could be difficult to work with. At one point, Joe Smith sends them a very cranky letter telling them to shape up. And their response to that is just to write "fuck you" on it and post it on the office wall. So
fearless though, right? Fearless.
Yeah, I mean,
how many bands would do that to a label? Most bands are working their ass off to get signed by a label, and they're going to do whatever they asked them to do.
They definitely did not feel constrained by it, but they did end up in debt, which then put some boundaries on their behavior. And they dreamed, as many bands do, of forming their own label, of breaking free of the music industry. They ultimately did, although with mixed success. So yes, from the very beginning, I mean, I think it's credit Joe Smith. He went out on a limb to hire a band that was very much at the edges of Warner Brothers universe. And ultimately, of course, very successful, but it was not easy all the way. There were definitely some clashes of culture along the way.
And Joe Smith was an older guy. He was from a different generation. But that was cool. He saw something in them. Yeah. He was tapping into something that the young audience was digging, and he got
definitely true. Yeah, I love the one of my favorite details in the book is that when he attended his first Dead show, he was there in his Carroll and Company blazer, and his wife was wearing pearls. And you could just I just have this image of the two of them just surrounded by kids.
Everybody just turning to look at who is this guy?
But yeah, he did it. I mean, he really did get them on there. He got them into. He's right when he says he's introducing the Grateful Dead to the world, and Jerry's right that they're introducing Warner Brothers to San Francisco. So that's what I mean in the book by saying that they each, in their own way, each of them was right.
Dark Star, what a wonderful enigma this song is. There's an early jam the band goes into on Dancing in the Street, where there's a moment where the music from Dark Star originates, and then Jerry's longtime songwriting partner, Robert Hunter, Dead fans know him very well. He was there for that show. The opening lyrics come pretty naturally afterwards. There's also a T.S. Eliot influence. If you could talk about the origins of this song and how it developed. The original single is like 2 minutes long. And it goes on to become, a 20-minute live jam.
Oh, and yeah, sometimes even longer. It becomes the iconic Grateful Dead, early Grateful Dead vehicle for jamming and for experimenting. And I love that. It's a Rio Nito show that you're referring to there, where you can hear in Dancing in the Street. There's a moment, I forget what the minute mark is, but I'm sure your listeners can find it. It's widely available. You can hear the chords go back and forth between Garcia and Lesh as they are dabbling in something they've clearly been playing with elsewhere, but they're sort of beginning to experiment with it on stage. And as you say, Hunter was there. He heard that. He then composed a piece of it right away, then composed some of it later in Golden Gate Park. He's such a widely read intellectual, really. And so he draws pieces from T.S. Eliot, pieces really just from his imagination. And even when he's drawing from other writers, he's changing it in ways that are very uniquely his own. So the result is it's both brilliant and nonsensical at the same time, right? It's a flashing of images more than a story. I mean, Hunter also wrote more traditional story songs. I'm thinking of Cumberland Blues or some of the other pieces that have a character and a story that are much more identifiably a song. This is much more of an experiment. In fact, back to our earlier conversation, this is the opposite of the Watts Towers, right? This is not a finished piece that is performed identically over and over, or that is well suited to an album. This is a live experience. Each time is different, and sometimes radically different, just from night to night. So it becomes the iconic Grateful Dead song, particularly of the 60s and 70s.
And what it means, nobody knows. It's whatever you want it to mean, and that is brilliant. And I'm sure you've seen this clip where Robert Hunter's asked about it, and he's lying down on the couch. This is many years. This is like just maybe a few years before he passed away, but He's lying on the couch. Says, what do those lyrics mean? He says, well, the dark star crashing, pouring its light into ashes, reason tatters, the forces tear loose from the axis. I mean, it's just what it says.
What? What's the question? Yeah, no. He's
so
a great enigma. He's fun. Yeah,
that is so great.
And yeah, it is. And I think really importantly, even when they performed it brilliantly, they didn't get frozen on a version of it, right? So they would perform it brilliantly one night and then come back the next night and perform it altogether differently.
Right.
And so there's something that to me is sort of the essence of particularly that early Dead, of them feeling their way through it, being willing to be bad, being willing to get it wrong or to have the audience not particularly enjoy it, or but just because the experience of it was the point of it.
There's a pivotal meeting in Dead history in August of 1968. The band, the managers, the band's engineer, Owsley Stanley, they meet to discuss some simmering issues. And another thing that's hard to imagine is Ron McKiernan and Bob Weir being fired from the band, but they were facing heat from Jerry and Phil Lesh. What happened? And is there a tape of this meeting? Does it exist?
Yeah, the tape is the meeting is as strange as the fact that it was taped. Both are really odd. And yes, the answer is there is a tape, and I quoted at great length. In fact, almost all of it, I think, is quoted in the book. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a juncture. It's a pivotal moment for the Grateful Dead, as you say, in the second half of 1968. Coming off of some of these more experimental efforts, Lesh and Garcia, and to some degree Tom Constantin, who was assisting on keyboards at that point, all saw a very psychedelic, open-ended future for the Grateful Dead. And they felt that Pigpen and Bob Weir were not keeping up. that they needed to develop musically in order for them all to progress. And so that had been a source of frustration through much of 1968. This meeting that you're describing and that this tape memorializes is of them with their, as you say, their managers and engineers essentially telling Weir and Pigpen that they're out, and that the band is going to move on without them because they haven't been able to keep up. Now, that said, it's a firing, but it's a Grateful Dead firing, and so they don't quite pull it off.
Yeah, they're not sure if they were fired, really, right? They
Yeah,
left the meeting saying,
the fact is they almost really don't miss any shows. There are a few performances after that of Garcia and Lesh and the drummers playing together as Bobby and the Midnights, and those are in essence what the Dead might have been had it gone on without Pigpen and Weir. But a better sense intervened, and Garcia and Lesh quickly realized that they'd made a mistake. Realized it quickly enough that they invited Weir and Pigpen to rejoin them. Very few, if any, actual scheduled gigs were affected by it. Pigpen missed a few gigs in the fall of '68, but it was really because his girlfriend was in the hospital, not because he'd been fired. So they got their wits back together and they went on. And as I noted in the book, that whole episode for me is interesting for several reasons. One, that it was recorded is strange. Obviously, this is not the kind of thing you would expect to have a tape of. Another is that it's the rare moment where you see Garcia really kind of taking some responsibility. He has to be really pushed into it. You can tell in the tape he's not enjoying this experience, nor would you expect him to. But he does step up and follow through with what approximates a firing, or a break anyway. But then the other thing I would say is it's a bad idea. I mean, even it's a difficult thing to do for friends, obviously, but it ends up really not being a good musical idea to dump Pigpen and Weir, because I do think Lesh and Garcia are mistaken, frankly, in that moment, in thinking that the Dead would be better by shedding their kind of jug band blues wing and focusing on a more experimental psychedelic wing. I mean, would have been a future. They're brilliant musicians and they would have made the most of it, of course. But what ends up being the hallmark of the Grateful Dead is that they don't choose between those styles, but that they bring them all together. And had they shed Weir and Pigpen at that early stage, I don't know that they ever would have gotten back around to that realization. So everyone is lucky that it didn't stick, really. And so better heads prevailed, but it didn't. In that evening, it seemed like it was about to break into pieces, and eventually it just obviously didn't.
The last few years of the 60s, turbulent for the Dead, obviously turbulent for the country. Their appearance at Woodstock, a disaster. The PA issues with the rain, the Altamont debacle led to tragedy, the Manson family murders. It seemed like the message of the counterculture movement of the mid-'60s that came out of San Francisco had been distorted. That freedom Jerry talked about turned dark. But you write, quote, the counterculture itself continued, and it did so in no small measure because the Dead survived. So talk about that and the Dead's influence in the early 70s.
Yeah, I think that well, particularly flashing forward even further forward into the 80s and beyond, as the counterculture changed, the Dead became more and more of a sort of guardian of the values of that period. But even as early as the 1970s, as particularly as the much of the counterculture turned much more violent, the Students for Democratic Society kind of migrated into the Weathermen. There were protests were increasingly violent. Bombings were more common in the early 70s. The Dead resisted both the war and the kind of mainstream refusal to accept them and the counterculture on one hand, but the Dead also resisted the kind of didacticism of the left. They were not fond of being told what to do by either the left or the right. And so they really are quite steady through the period. They stick to their values, they stick to their art. And despite pressure from each side, they are much more associated with the left, and properly so. That's really where they're situated, I think, in the cultural history of all of this. But they're not drawn into a violent response to Vietnam, for instance, which much of the counterculture was. They find common cause with the Black Panthers and the Hells Angels. They're the rare the rare people who saw value in both the Hells Angels and the Black Panthers, but not because of their politics or their violence, which both of them engaged in, but more because of their kind of community cohesion around those groups. And so they knew what they liked, and they were steadfast about that. And so I think that's a big part of why they remain a kind of touchstone of culture over such a long period, is the culture is swirling and changing all around them, but they're pretty good about steering a straight course through all that.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Oh, just in time for lunch.
There was a point in the mid-'70s where the Dead stopped touring, but they reemerged in 76, and 77 is a landmark year for the band. Talk about that period of the Dead. It was like a rebirth for them, a rebirth for counterculture with Nixon being out of the White House, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real moment of kind of liberation, I think. They had, well, as noted earlier, they had formed their own record label. They had come off the road, and really kind of retreated back to north of the Bay up in Marin County, San Rafael, where they worked on solo projects and produced Blues for Allah, a Grateful Dead album that they produced while they were on this hiatus. Again, the Grateful Dead is often successful sort of despite itself. And in this sense, I think they didn't really, there's something ill-conceived about the idea of the Grateful Dead coming off the road, because fundamentally, as we've already discussed, the energy of the Grateful Dead was always on the road. It was always in relation to audiences. And so the idea that they would be some other kind of non-touring enterprise doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think gradually they came to see that as they were off the road and doing their own projects. And so eventually they realized that they wanted to be out there again. They wanted to be together. And they did. So they come back out in 76. As you say, 77 shows, the spring of 77, produced some of the shows most revered by fans. Cornell is a special.
Cornell, New Haven,
also
Connecticut.
Sportorium, New Haven,
Yeah.
Sportorium in Florida. A lot of really great music in that period. And a sense that they were at it again. They started small with a lot of smaller venues, got bigger again. There's another through line of the Grateful Dead, which is trying to keep things small. And they struggle with that because they are so popular that it's hard to keep it small. But there are these interludes throughout their history where they sort of ratchet back down. In this case, for instance, they sold off the Wall of Sound. They came back out as a smaller, more nimble enterprise. So they're always ratcheting up and ratcheting down. The audiences are kind of pushing that. But that period of 77, early 77 in particular, I think is often regarded as a real halcyon moment for them.
We know the rebirth of the Dead's popularity in the 80s because of Touch of Grey in 1987, but it really was more than just that, right? I mean, it was, like you say, in the coldness of the 80s, the Dead offered warmth. So was it that the counterculture was that way of life that came out of the 60s was now living on through new generations?
Yeah, there's no way to prove this, but here's, well, I'll offer you my take on it anyway, which is that, and not uniquely mine. I mean, I've talked to many other people who I think buy into this, so it's not, I didn't invent this idea, but the 1980s, if the 1960s, the Grateful Dead and Ronald Reagan sort of spar in California and kind of circle each other with competing values. In the 1980s, they do the same thing again, but they just do it on a national stage. This time Reagan runs for it and, of course, is elected president. And the Dead emerges as this much bigger than California band, really a national phenomenon by then. And that's even before Touch of Grey, which then puts them stratospherically into another level. But I do think one thing that's going on there is that Reagan and the culture around him they were mean-spirited, they were capitalistic, Greed is good, right? Was the sort of shorthand for the early 1980s. In Grateful Dead land, greed was not good. The Dead and their values continued to be about kindness and compassion and freedom and creativity and improvisation and living in the moment, in in tending to one's larger family, a family of artists and others like people, creative people. They were not changed, but the culture around them had changed and had really hardened from the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And so I do think part of what happened is that people who craved that, people, particularly young people, but not just young people, but who were looking for something that was the opposite of greed, and the sort of malevolent, the nuclear war machine, and the environmental dismissiveness of Washington. Uh, People who were outside that found the Grateful Dead, and the number of people who admired their music and the culture around them grew and grew and grew, starting in the early 80s and then really exploding with Touch of Grey and MTV, and by the late 80s they are gigantic.
Tape sharing was huge because my older brother gave me New Haven 77, and I still have the Max L cassette. And I was a fan because of Touch of Grey, like so many. But the moment I pressed play on that, it was life-changing.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
if they
yeah,
don't
taping
allow
is-
tape sharing, what is the Grateful Dead today?
Oh, good question.
Right?
Yeah, well, as with so many things, and we've already talked about a few of them, the Dead was brilliant, sort of despite itself or without a plan, really. Tapers had been at shows going way back. And the Dead never really cared. Jerry famously said, once I'm done with the notes, I'm done with them. You can do whatever you want with them. The music industry did not love that approach. The music industry saw that as the opportunity for bootlegging, which then it viewed as undermining album sales. The Dead, they had taped other artists. Jerry himself, Bob, had taped artists. So they weren't offended by taping, and they didn't make that much money off albums anyway. For them, it really wasn't much of a hindrance. So they were always very relaxed about it. By the 80s, though, tapers had become a bit of a bother. And I remember this from shows. I mean, partly because they didn't want people dancing around them. They didn't want people jostling their equipment. And so the taping per se didn't bother the band much, but the atmosphere around tapers was bothering some members of the audience. So they created what they called the tapester section, later the taper section, which, to my knowledge anyway, at least certainly in those days, was the only band to do this, where they moved it around a little bit, eventually settled in just behind the soundboard. And tapers could sit there, they could have their boom mics, they could have their equipment. And there was not only was there no penalty, they were openly allowed to be there. So they didn't have to hide or hide their equipment or shush people around them because they had their own section. And then that, of course, fed this community of taping. There were no real enforced rules around taping or distribution of tapes. It was understood that you weren't to sell them, that they were to be traded, not for profit. There are moments where the Dead rose up to protect its copyright, usually when someone tried to press tapes or something into vinyl, or copied an album without permission. But for the most part, they not only didn't discourage, but actually encouraged taping of shows and trading of tapes. And it became this whole other culture. I mean, this giant culture on top of the Grateful Dead culture.
That's what I was about to say. What fascinates me is this idea that it doesn't matter the size of your audience, not necessarily, because if you have one person that buys a ticket on night one, that same person buys a ticket on nights 2 and 3. 3 tickets are sold. Yeah, it's just one person, but 3 tickets. And you multiply that times how many other Dead fans are out there. That is something that I wonder why other bands don't really pick up on. But then again, it's not so easy to change up your set list every night. But that's why people were coming back for nights 2 and 3. It wasn't the exact same set list. And as we know, most bands are militant about that. The set list is exactly the same. Maybe we'll switch a song out with another. but they did not do that. And the songs sounded differently every night. I mean, essentially the same, but like you say with Dark Star, maybe this one has a little jazz jam inside of it. Maybe in the next night it's got a little bluesy thing going on. To me, it's brilliant, but it speaks to the musical talent that the band had in order to do that. It's not that easy.
And the courage. I mean,
The courage.
yeah, I mean, the idea that you're going out there without I mean, they always had a rough idea of, what was in, what they were playing in those months of any given tour. But where are you going to start? Where are you going to end up with? How's that? Is the jam going to be 10 minutes or 20 or this commitment to listening to each other and making it up as they went along? That takes a lot of guts, and a willingness to fail, and I would add an audience that permitted that, right? I mean, so I never in the time, I mean, I didn't go to as many Dead shows as many people did, but I never once heard a person say, "Oh, I want my money back," or "That was a horror." It was just part of it, right? It was just it was the ride. And so the fact that the audience enjoyed even those off nights or was sort of interested in them allowed them to be that.
Yeah, there's a story to
all
be
those
told.
pieces fit together. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
there's a story to be told within each show. And I love watching the videos of each band member just looking at each other, maybe the nod, and you're fast like, what is going on inside of their head? Like John Mayer was talking about when he first joined, and Bob Weir was like, yeah, we're going to play such and such song. And Mayer's like, all right, cool. But he's like, all of a sudden mid song, he decides to just change up the tempo, and he's and he had to be ready. Like he had to be, and he's a top notch musician. Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Come out wherever you are.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. You talked about how Jerry and the band wanted to keep it small, and in 1981 there was a reporter that pissed off or tried to piss off Jerry, and he said it was absurd and disastrous that the Dead had been meandering along for 16 years, and Jerry's response was, I don't give a damn. In fact, I'd be afraid if everybody liked us. I don't want the responsibility. But that's what happens by the end of the 80s, right? This was a burden for him. This is when we start to get into the 90s, and now he's not enjoying this as much, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of things come together in that period. Not most of them not good. To cite the first one is that they became huge, right? Between Touch of Grey, In the Dark, the album suddenly was a hit. The MTV drew new fans to them. Suddenly people were coming to shows with no tickets and not even with any intention of getting in, just to be there and to sort of experience the culture around it. And of course, Garcia by then was battling an increasingly losing struggle against heroin and drugs generally. And so his enjoyment faded. I happened to be at the show in 1986 at RFK Stadium when they played with Bob Dylan. It was roastingly hot. I mean, they say you can't remember pain. I can remember how hot it was that day. And I was just in the audience. Garcia looked terrible. People around me were talking about it. And then the next day flew back to San Francisco, and then soon after fell into a coma. And so his health was precarious, to say the least. He did, by the way, I should add, he did recover from that, and actually got clean for a while, and they produced some brilliant shows.
Had to learn how to play all over again.
Yeah, I mean, it was a real comeback, and it was exciting. By the joy that people had in his return was just lovely. But then he relapsed, and it caught up with him again. And so by the end of the '80s and into the early '90s. It was getting too big. He was overwhelmed, and like The Hate and The Summer of Love, big is not always great for counterculture or for or music even. And it just became harder and harder to keep it going without the mishaps of a giant enterprise like that. And so I think it became more of a burden for him. And I'll just one more note on that. Other bands could have, the Dead could have stopped, right? They could have said, forget it. We need to take 6 months off. But most bands could do that because most revenue for most bands is generated by albums. The Grateful Dead had this huge community of people they supported who worked for them. And if they stopped touring, the money stopped coming in. So they felt a responsibility, again, back to this word responsibility, to keep that community alive and healthy. And so to stop was not just to make a decision that they could personally afford. By this point, they were all quite wealthy, but that would put people they cared about out of work, that would have really ground the enterprise to a halt. And so the pressure to go on was immense. And they succumbed to it, and that got harder and harder.
In that documentary, that great what a long strange trip it's been.
That's
it was
right.
Jerry's girlfriend. It was a girlfriend from his early years, and then they rekindled the relationship later years. And she says Jerry pulled her aside one day, and he said, I could just walk away and live off of the Ben and Jerry's money, right? And she said, well, just do it. He says, you don't get it. He said, I've got 50 people, road crew, band members that depend on me, and I've got millions of fans who depend on me to go out there every year, year after year, 10 months out of the year, because they're looking to have their good time for 2-3 hours.
Yeah.
I can't. And he couldn't go out for a walk. He couldn't go to the store. He couldn't do what he wanted to do. And thus you have the escape in the drugs. And
yeah,
we lost the
paradox of it is awful. It's tragic. And for me, the most painful parts of working on the book were watching him sort of come apart in those later years. I was up at the archive at UC Santa Cruz, which has a Grateful Dead archive, which is extremely important to me in producing this book. And one day I was going through bank records of the band, and it has Garcia's personal bank records, or part of it from I think this is 93, 94. And you see on several days him making 5, 6, 7 trips to the ATM to take out $200 or $300 each time. And you can just see the addiction working on him. The fact that at that point that he is successful beyond any dream he had when he was, fresh out of the army in Palo Alto in 1965 or 1960, 61, he's so far beyond that now, and yet things are falling apart for him personally. And it's really, he died at age 53. He obviously, were it not for the drugs, he would have presumably lived a lot longer, but it really took a toll on him for sure.
Yeah, I can't remember her name. I apologize, but she
Bridget.
said, what was
Bridget
it?
Meyer. Bridget Meyer, yeah.
Right. And she's the one who said, I know you're doing drugs again. That's fine. But I need you to be open with me and just tell me, and so we can communicate. And there's a pause, and he looks right at her, cold stare. He says, thank you very much. You can leave. It was great. We had a great time. It's time to go. Wow. It was...
Yeah, well, I don't know. This is not probably the forum to talk about it, but anyone who has dealt with an addict knows that if you force them to choose, they will not always make the right decision. I think for Garcia, in that moment, he's incapable of understanding what he's giving up. But it was a
heartbreaking,
heavy price. It's heartbreaking. You're right.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
During our brief intermission, let's take a flying trip from the land of fantasy to everyday life.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. So I'll finish with this. Obviously, we know the Grateful Dead, they the music continued. I mean, your epilogue says, quote, "The Grateful Dead died with Jerry Garcia," and it sure did. But the members moved on, and we know they've different formations. But as for Counterculture, you write that, quote, "It is unfair to those who participated in the counterculture of the 1960s or who have joined it since to argue that simply because the movement did not achieve what it set out to do, it was inconsequential. In fact, the counterculture influences our lives today in profound, broad, and specific ways." Please, could you expand on that? And we'll finish with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those ways are very obvious. Right? We are, as a society, we're much more accepting of Eastern religious practices, Buddhism, Hinduism, others that are much more part of our culture today, right, than they were before the 60s. Health foods, organic foods. There's a whole ways in which the counterculture has infused itself into our being, really, and into our politics. Some of the things that were contentious about that the counterculture confronted are now beyond dispute. We don't genuinely dispute that segregation is a desirable. I mean, I'm sure there are some outliers, but as a society, we accept that racial equality is an ambition of the society, gender equality. So there are the respect for the environment. Largely bipartisan consensus around that today. In what fashion is something we still debate, but there are big principles of the counterculture that have settled into our lives that we no longer even think to argue about. That's what I mean by it influencing us. Now, I would also say there are things about the counterculture that have affected that didn't succeed or that have affected us in ways that are not a success. So yes, the counterculture ended the Vietnam War. I mean, I think that's a hallmark of its influence. It didn't fundamentally, though, change the way we think about war. We still resort to violence to solve problems between nations. That's a shortcoming, I would say, of the counterculture and its influence. Drugs, the counterculture celebrated drugs. I'm not here to proselytize about drugs one way or another, but I would note that among others, they killed Jerry Garcia. And the counterculture didn't have to wrestle with fentanyl or some of the more dangerous drugs that we have today, but it celebrated and even glorified drugs in a way that I think, in retrospect, feels reckless. So there are influences that continue to shadow or affect our lives for better and for worse. I think that is a reminder that this was and is a powerful movement, a powerful current of American life. I think for the most part, we should be happy about that. But that is not to say that everything it did turned to gold.
Here beside the rising tide, Jerry Garcia, The Grateful Dead, and An American Awakening. It is out now. Find it wherever books are sold. You can look for it at your nearest bookstore. Find your nearest independent bookstore at thebookedonrock.com. And Jim, can people find you online if they want to reach out to you?
They can. You can find me at UCLA. You can find me on Twitter or whatever the fuck do we call it. Sorry, whatever we call Twitter these days. But I'm also on Threads and et cetera. I'm easily found. So look me up. I'm happy to get a message.
And did I see you're in one of the O.J. Simpson documentaries, right?
I was the lead reporter for the LA Times on the O.J.
Wow.
Simpson. It's another life. That's another long conversation right there.
It's so funny. Yeah, once I saw you on camera, I said, wait a minute, I've seen him before on TV. Yeah, man. That's cool, man. Jim, thank you so much for doing this. This is a fantastic conversation and a topic that I can talk forever about. The Grateful Dead.
Well, you and me both, and I sure appreciate the chance to talk with you. Thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.